From soaring global temperatures to droughts and severe flooding, climate change continues to negatively impact the planet. Ecosystems have changed so drastically that many areas are now uninhabitable for animals. Recent research has revealed that 40% of amphibians are now facing extinction because of global warming. For more on this research, I'm joined by Professor John Measey from Stellenbosch University Centre of Invasion Biology, which took part in the study. Prof, I appreciate your time this evening. First question is a simple one. What are amphibians? Give us an example of some of them.
What are amphibians? So amphibians are animals. Most of your listeners will probably be more familiar with them in Southern Africa, being frogs specifically.
So now we're talking about extreme weather events such as wildfires, droughts or hurricanes that have been exacerbated by climate change and have had a detrimental impact on amphibians. How are they impacted, actually?
Well, obviously, amphibians rely on water. So when you have things like extreme droughts, then amphibians are going to suffer. Similarly, if you have storm surges that involve salt water coming onto the land, then again, amphibians are going to get hammered in those coastal areas. So things that are generally bad for us are also bad for amphibians.
So when we talk about amphibians being on the verge of extinction, or they face those sort of challenges, it must indicate that we have an idea of how many amphibians there are. I mean, we're talking about how many frogs there are. Do we know the number, or is it just the absence of them, or based on certain conditions that we are experiencing?
So my role in this study was to be the chair of the Southern African region of experts for red listing amphibians in this region. And what we did was look at species and determine whether populations of each species are threatened with extinction or not. So we tend to not look at individuals and count individuals, but we look at threats to populations and therefore species. And they are facing multiple threats. These include the kinds of droughts and extreme weather events that you were talking about, but also generally climate change. So changes in places where they live. They have evolved over millions of years to live in particular niches. And when those change, especially when we come and we change those environments, then they have nowhere left to go.
So you raise an interesting issue there, Prof, and that's the issue of evolution, that these amphibians have evolved over time. Now, has global warming just kind of crept up on them? Because the assumption would be that part of that process of evolvement is dealing with global warming, so to speak.
Absolutely. So changes in temperature have happened to them over millions of years, and they have adapted over those periods of time. And what's happening now is that these changes are happening extremely rapidly. So if you look at only the past 50 years, they've not only coped with changes in temperatures and amount of rainfall, but they've also lost habitat. So think about all of the places that have grown. What's good for humans, as I mentioned earlier, is also good for amphibians. So the very spots that we're building our houses, we're draining wetlands because we don't want to have our houses in wetlands, and that's bad for them as well. So if you think of it, they're rather like indicators that are showing us the problems that we are creating into the environment.
Now, the assessment, and you indicated that you were a part of the assessment, I think you said you were chair, evaluated the extinction risk of over 8,000 amphibian species. Could you share some insights into the methodology used to assess the extinction risk and how experts contributed to this evaluation?
Sure. So I was chair of the Southern African region, not of the whole project. And what we do with red listing in general, this is an IUCN protocol, and it's one that has been built up over many decades, is that we think about each species, and we think about all the populations in those species. We look at where they're reported to occur and whether that's changed within the time frame since the previous assessment. So one of the ways that we do that is we actually now look at a lot of citizen science data. So people out there who are reporting or taking pictures or recordings of frogs and putting them on platforms like iNaturalist, we actually use that data when we make our assessments. So the chances are that if you did that 5 or 6 years ago, then that information was included in the last assessment. But if you do it now, it will be included in the next assessment. And we're just about to come up to making another round of assessments for the Southern African region. And again, we're going to look to see whether those changes that have happened in the past 5 years are meaning that amphibians are getting better or worse in their conservation status.
Professor, the one conversation that we oft have is around how Africa contributes 3 to 4% of carbon emissions, or certainly towards global warming. Now, the destruction caused by global warming is obviously far greater. Now, when we look at amphibians on the African continent versus the rest of the world, how do those stats measure up in terms of the levels of extinction that we are envisioning, or the levels of threat that we are talking about?
Yes. No matter how much Southern Africa is putting into or contributing towards climate change, the effects are global. And so it is not just the sum of what Southern Africa is doing, it's actually the sum of what the whole world is doing. And those things are impacting our species here. On a more specific level, so on a more local level, in Southern Africa, we are obviously using up resources, we are changing land use, and we're doing things like draining wetlands. And my particular group at Stellenbosch University looks at invasive species. So one of the big impacts that we're doing in Southern Africa is we're introducing things like invasive fish into systems, and we are spreading invasive trees. Those are drying up wetlands. And so all of these things contribute extra stresses towards those species. And so every time we assess a population, we also not only look at the numbers of animals in that population, but we assess the habitat. Is the habitat invaded with fish or trees, and are those having a detrimental effect on the species? So there's more to it than simply climate change, or more to it than just habitat change. But there are a lot of factors that we look at in terms of every population, every species.
So we've had this conversation for the last 10 minutes about all the destruction that we're doing and the harm that we're causing these amphibians. How do we put a stop to it, and how do we reverse it? I mean, what's the plan? What have been your recommendations? Has that been part of your study?
Absolutely. We are very, and you make a really important point that it's very easy to talk about all the negative things, but there are also positive things as well. So we see Southern Africa has a very good network of reserves, and they do a lot of the protection for the threatened species that we have. And some of those in some places are increasing in size. So those reserves are very important, but now the change in people's attitude towards these animals is also important. So it's very important for people, for listeners who have some of these threatened amphibians in their area, to actually make their environments more amenable to those animals. So they can do that by introducing wetlands, for example, into their own properties, but those would have to be specific to the particular area that they live in. One of the things is that we have a very diverse landscape, and that includes diverse weather conditions. And so a lot of these species, they're tuned towards having dry summers, for example, if you're in the Cape, but wet summers if you are in the Highveld area. And so these differences are very, very important to the amphibians, and they may be expecting a pond in your garden to dry out. And if it doesn't, then that's not necessarily very good for them. But it has to dry out at the right time of year, and it has to fit into their own habitat requirements. So finding out more about these animals would be really, really good for general members of the public, especially those who have some kind of land that they want to dedicate towards amphibian conservation.
Now, you speak about some of the positives that have been happening, and one of those areas is the 120 amphibian species improved their red list status since 1980 due to conservation action. Could you elaborate on some successful conservation efforts and their impacts on these species?
Sure. So some of the things that have been done are specific reserves that encompass areas where those animals live. So one of the things about amphibians is that instead of some of the species occurring over very big areas of land, some of them are really specific to very small areas. So in the Cape here, we have one species, for example, that only occurs on Table Mountain. We have another 2 species that only occur on the Cape Peninsula. So those areas are relatively small, and therefore turning them into reserves or making specific changes to increase the conservation of those animals is relatively straightforward and doesn't require the same amount of effort that you would if the distribution of the range was over a much larger area. And we have had examples in Southern Africa of new reserves that have been created specifically to threaten frogs. So that's fantastic news, and there's potential for more. So hopefully, in the future, if we have this conversation again in 5 years' time, I'll be able to tell you about more positive news for amphibians in the region.
So let's talk about some of those amphibians that are more prone to the struggle, to the challenges, if you will. Are there any specific types of amphibians that are struggling more than others, or are more at risk?
Yeah, probably, almost certainly animals that are at high altitude are suffering, because that's where some of the changes, the temperature changes are most impacted. But also, I would say that thinking locally, some of our most highly threatened species are in lowland areas. So lowlands we often forget about because they are such transformed areas. They're very good for us to build houses on and for us to plant crops in. And so that habitat change has really impacted a lot of those species. In Cape Town, for example, one of the most well-known amphibian species is the western leopard toad. I don't know if you've heard of this. And the western leopard toad is a large and very brightly colored animal that a lot of people here are very familiar with. And yet the areas that it used to live in and thrive in are now covered in houses and ponds. But very positive things are happening. So people who like these animals are helping them cross roads. They're providing places for them to breed in their own private gardens. And so there are some very positive things that are happening in terms of those animals. And the more people come to know about them, the more people actually enjoy them and like having them in their gardens. In the summers, these animals appear in the evenings, and they eat a lot of pests that are so snails and other insects that are otherwise eating people's garden plants.
Fantastic. Professor, I look forward to speaking to you again on 6 October 2028, and that's in 5 years, as you've suggested. Appreciate your time this evening. Professor John Measey from the Stellenbosch University Centre of Invasion Biology.